This autumn sees the return of a much-loved nature series to BBC Two, The Natural World. From outer space, a satellite's view of Africa and help for a Kenyan game reserve, to the depths of the ocean. The unforeseen effects a Second World War battle had on a sleepy Pacific lagoon, creating from the wreckage unusual lairs for some fearsome fish. On a more friendly note, there's a look at the work of wildlife artist Keith Brocky, whose detailed studies are of use to scientists. The summit of Kinabalu in remote Borneo is the setting for unusual and exotic displays of plant and animal life. And the strangest of all the species on Earth, the intrepid cameraman, who boldly swims where no man has swum before. A baby brother's wide-eyed innocence and his elder sister's coy reactions reveal new insights into family life among the wild chimpanzees. A new series of The Natural World this autumn on BBC Two.
Newsnight in half an hour includes a look at the implications of today's decision by the High Court to seize all the assets of the NUM, and there's a report from Grenada, a year after the American intervention. On BBC One now, Sir Robin Day is in the chair for another edition of Question Time, with three members of Parliament, David Alton, Joan Maynard and David Mellor, joined by Lady Ralphs, chairman of the Council of the Magistrates Association, debating the issues of the week. And current affairs are brought right up to date now here on 2 in Newsnight.
Good evening. The pit dispute goes on. Talks to settle the miners' strike ended earlier tonight with little sign of any real progress, though they could restart next week. Meanwhile, a High Court judge has ordered the seizure of the entire assets of the National Union of Mine Workers for its failure to pay a £200,000 contempt fine. The judge accused the union of willful disobedience and said its leaders have only themselves to blame. However, Arthur Scargill has retorted that the court order will only strengthen their resolve. They'll continue their fight against pit closures. We'll be discovering what the law will do now from a legal expert at the London School of Economics, and what the miners will do from the Labour editor of The Guardian. The Labour Party has elected a new shadow cabinet. Tony Benn and Eric Heffer have failed to gain places. From Westminster, Vincent Hanna assesses the results and speaks to Gerald Kaufman, who topped tonight's poll. And exactly 1 year after the Americans went into Grenada, we return to the island to find out what its people now feel about their invaders.
Italian police move in on the mafia again. They've rounded up another 56 suspected mobsters. Just a month after ex-mafia leader Tommaso Buscetta's confessions put 100 people behind bars. It's said 2 other mafia men have now turned informer. The French mock bomb, Mrs. Thatcher says it was wholly wrong that explosives were brought into this country, but she doesn't want it to spoil President Mitterrand's visit. And the Speaker of West Germany's Parliament, Rainer Barzel, resigns. He's been accused of taking bribes from a big industrial group.
Well, it happened yesterday with NACODS, but it hasn't happened tonight with the NUM. After 10 hours at ACAS, the miners and the coal board have adjourned their talks without reaching agreement. The two sides are to be reconvened by ACAS at an early date, probably next week, but no signs of a settlement are in sight. The NCB negotiators left ACAS headquarters this evening saying they wanted time to assess the position, but Mr. Scargill was frank about the gulf still separating board and union.
I would say that there's been no movement at today's meeting, and although points of view have been expressed, we're still fundamentally in disagreement about the central issues.
The day's other vital development in the dispute was at the High Court in London, where Mr. Justice Nichols ordered the sequestration of the total assets of the NUM because of its failure to pay a £200,000 fine. The judge said the union had had ample opportunity to pay the fine, imposed 2 weeks ago after Mr. Scargill and the NUM had disobeyed an earlier court ruling that the miners' strike in Yorkshire should not be described as official. Like that original injunction, today's sequestration was applied for by 2 Yorkshire miners, Ken Fulston and Bob Taylor. Their case throughout has been that in the absence of the ballot required by the NUM rulebook, the action in Yorkshire cannot be held to be official, nor can miners there be threatened with disciplinary measures for crossing picket lines. A personal fine of £1,000 imposed on Mr Scargill 2 weeks ago for his individual contempt of court has been settled by an anonymous donor, but no one has come forward to perform a similar service for the union itself, so it is still in contempt and has now had all its assets, property as well as funds frozen by the sequestration order. Giving judgment today, Mr Justice Nichols explained that what had brought the NUM to this sorry state was its refusal to accept that its members have rights against their union which the law should be ready to protect. Within an hour of the High Court order being made, the wife of the NUM president, Mrs Anne Scargill, was also at the union headquarters. She arrived in a black Rover and took away some files and other office equipment. And tonight, Mr Scargill himself, denying that the sequestration would make any difference to the strike, said it would actually strengthen our resolve. So how much financial damage can the court order do to the NUM? One complication for the sequestrators is the structure of the union, with its national funds being administered separately from area funds which can't be touched. Nationally, the NUM is not as rich as it is in the regions. The union derives its regular income from membership subscriptions, and last year that amounted to about £7 million. But this year, no union dues from striking miners have been coming in since March. Ironically, therefore, the sole income in that time has been from the dues of working miners, still automatically deducted by the coal board and passed on to the union. On that basis, the union probably hasn't collected more than £2.6 million this year. Also on the credit side are the NUM's assets, which totalled £9.3 million at the beginning of the year. £7.3 million of that was cash in the bank, or took the form of swiftly realisable investments. The rest had been invested in a building plot in Sheffield for the construction of the new national headquarters. So, altogether this year, the union has had access to a total of £9.9 million. Of course, running the strike has been enormously expensive, with payments to pickets and transport costs. Much of this has been paid for at local area level, but with the help of £400,000, which, according to some reports, the National Union had donated by the end of July. Apart from that, the NUM has had its usual large overheads to meet, with regular bills of £150,000 a week, adding up to £6.2 million altogether. So the remaining target, therefore, for the sequestrators is the balance of £3.3 million, a sum which leaves out of account that money tied up in building land in Sheffield, and which also assumes that the NUM has not taken the perhaps obvious precaution of hiving off more of its central funds to the areas. Well, joining me now to try and sort out the legal complexities and something of the political impact of today's events are Bob Simpson of the London School of Economics and Keith Harper of The Guardian. First of all, Keith Harper, a word about the ACAS talks. In view of Mr Scargill's often repeated remarks today about not having any hope of the outcome, are you surprised at all that the talks have only been adjourned and not actually called off altogether?
Yes, I am surprised. I think that everybody went into those talks today thinking that they probably wouldn't get further than lunchtime. The fact is that by a thin thread they are kept going, and I think it's really by the good offices of ACAS, the Conciliation Service. I think that once or twice during this long day there have been suggestions of a breakdown, but they have kept going. And significantly, ACAS will try and bring them together next week when they will talk about the plan for coal again and the declaration by the coal board that it alone has the responsibility for closing uneconomic pits.
And is it your understanding that uneconomic pits, that term is still very much on the agenda, or are they trying, through ACAS, to get off that onto the suggestion of defining instead exhausted pits? What's happening on that?
Well, they are obviously trying to do that. It's being circulated by the coal board, and it's a fact that Mr Michael Eaton, the new aide-de-camp to Mr McGregor, would like to push forward. But here we come to the politics of the NCB itself. One doesn't really know how much power Mr Eaton has got at the coal board. And I think that he will probably have a great battle in order to get that point of view across with his other colleagues, Mr McGregor and Mr Cowans, the Deputy Chairman. But at the moment, yes, we're circulating on that particular point, but also on the plan for coal and how, in fact, that can be changed with the cooperation of the coal board, the union and the government.
So on the matter of today's legal developments, do you think Mr Scargill is justified in claiming tonight, as we've heard, that the court order will only strengthen the resolve of the NUM to go on with the strike?
Well, so far the evidence shows just that the miners are not swayed by anything that the courts do. I mean, we just have to take the South Wales example to use that as a justification. I don't think it will affect the miners' stance. And it's significant, you see, that it is in some ways different to the fight that the NGA, the other union which was involved in this kind of action, took last year. It, at the end, did not have the support of the TUC. This time, we are led to believe, the miners has the full-hearted support of the TUC.
Now, Bob Simpson of LSE, is it your understanding that today's court order is applied to and can only be applied to the national funds of the NUM?
That's correct, yes, because the NUM nationally is a separate and distinct union from each of the areas, which is a union in its own right. So the problem will be identifying those funds which belong to the NUM nationally alone.
How difficult will that be for the sequestrators, do you think?
Well, one doesn't know exactly, but it could be very difficult for the reason you've already alluded to, that it's quite legitimate for the National Union of Mine Workers to transfer funds to the areas and as a matter of normal practice. And over the past few months, they've had excellent reason to do that without being called into question on any possible grounds that they were doing it to protect the funds against court orders of this kind.
If there was a suspicion that they had been channeling or out or hiving off many more funds than paying for the strike, for example, or helping to pay for the strike, in order to preempt a possible judgment which has now arrived today, could the sequestrators do anything about that?
Well, that's one of the unexplored areas yet. It has been touched on in previous instances, like the NGA case, which Keith Harper mentioned, and the South Wales case earlier. But the sums involved were never large enough to actually push the sequestrators that far, so they had to get involved in that sort of dispute. But it could become an issue, obviously, if large fines are imposed. I don't think this fine is actually big enough to cause the sequestrators that type of problem.
Now, in the South Wales case, where sequestration was also imposed in funds because of the failure of the NUM there to obey a court ruling against unlawful picketing, there were great scenes of occupying the building and so on. And this is happening again in Sheffield now at the NUM headquarters. Is that relevant?
Not at this stage, I don't think, because if the sequestrators actually had to go to the trouble of getting hold of physical assets like that, it would suggest that the NUM's liquid assets were very low indeed. You have to remember that although they've been given power to sequestrate all unions' assets, it's probable that what they'll do is only collect sufficient to go well on top of the fine and costs. And they may well do what happened in the South Wales case, which is then go back to court and say, shall we stop now? Because the cost of actually getting hold of the rest is prohibitive.
But in theory, could they go on putting the fine up and meeting the fine from whatever funds they were able to sequestrate if the NUM continued to show a refusal to purge its contempt?
Well, the NUM would have to commit a fresh act of contempt, and they could then, the two miners concerned, could go back to court and ask the court to impose a higher fine, which one assumes it would then do. And one of the reasons for taking more funds than is necessary to pay this particular fine and costs is to make provision for that eventuality. And the judge might well take the view that such a provision is right and proper, because he might say the union's attitude has been so far that it intends to continue, if necessary, by committing acts which do amount to further contempt.
Keith Harper, having heard all that, do you still say that the miners aren't going to be bothered one way or the other by what the court has decided today or what the sequestrators will do over the next week or two?
Well, to judge from what Mr. Scargill says, and he in fact is basically running the union at the moment, yes, I don't think they're going to be that bothered. They will continue to defy the law. That's what he says, and that's what we are led to believe. And I don't think, in fact, that he will be swayed from that. I think what may happen in the next few days is that Mr. Scargill and his colleagues will go and seek help from the TUC if they need it, in order to bring the trade union movement to a wider confrontation with the law, which is what the NGA tried to do last year and failed.
Keith Harper, Bob Simpson, thanks both very much indeed. Paul.
Coming shortly, Grenada a year after, and how Mr. Benn did not get back into the shadow cabinet. But first, a look at today's other news. Police in Italy have launched a major blitz against the mafia again. So far, 56 people have been arrested and more are being sought. Hundreds of police, using armoured cars, helicopters and dogs, carried out the arrests, which centred on the mafia stronghold of Palermo in Sicily. There were other arrests in Bari, in Rome and in Bologna. The latest crackdown is said to be linked to the confessions of Tommaso Buscetta, the mafia boss whose disclosures have already put more than 100 suspected mobsters behind bars. But it seems 2 other mafia men have now also turned police informer. All those arrested today have been charged with drug trafficking. Some have also been charged with murder. The Common Market has promised immediate emergency aid to help the victims of famine in Ethiopia. It said an extra 35,000 tonnes of grain will be made available in the next 2 months. Nearly a third of that will be sent off straight away. The EC also promised nearly £2 million to buy lorries and other materials to distribute the food, but the aid is considerably less than European charities had hoped for. Britain and France have been trying to cool the row over the planting of explosives by a French security guard at the ambassador's residence in London. Officials in Paris say British policemen asked the Frenchman to hide the explosives to test security. Scotland Yard said they had no prior knowledge. Mrs Thatcher told the Commons that the incident should not mar President Mitterrand's visit.
This was a most regrettable incident, and the French authorities are aware of our views. It was wholly wrong for the individual to have acted as he did, and they have regretted the misunderstanding. It is a matter of the most serious concern that explosive materials were brought into this country. Urgent discussions have begun and will continue with the French government about this incident.
It's reported tonight that the French journalist sentenced to 18 years in jail in Afghanistan has been released. Jacques Abou Shah has been pardoned by the president of Afghanistan. He was jailed on Saturday after being charged with illegally entering the country. Britain has agreed to pay £37,500 in compensation to a woman whose husband was shot dead by British troops in Northern Ireland 13 years ago. It settles the case brought before the European Commission of Human Rights. Thomas McLaughlin was killed by soldiers who mistook him for a terrorist. The case against the Conservative MP, Dr Keith Hampson, who was charged with indecently assaulting a policeman in a Soho gay club, has been dropped. The prosecution offered no evidence at Southwark Crown Court in London today. Last week, in a 2-day trial, the jury hearing the allegations against Dr Hampson failed to agree. Today, the judge ordered a verdict of not guilty to be entered. Car workers at Austin Rover's 2 biggest plants have voted in favour of a strike. The men at Longbridge and Cowley want an extra £22 a week. The company has offered about 10. But at Vauxhall's Luton plant, 7,000 workers voted to end their strike. They've accepted a deal worth £12 a week now and another 6 in May. Trading was subdued on the stock exchange today amid concern over progress in talks to settle the miners' dispute. But there were some gains. The FT 30 share index closed at 870, up 3.8. Intervention by the West German Bundesbank in support of the mark helped the pound, and the sterling index closed at 75.2, up 0.3. And in New York, the pound closed at $1.2255, up more than 0.5% from this morning's opening level in London. And the Dow Jones index closed at 1,211.02, down 5.41.
A year ago today, most of us knew only vaguely of Grenada as an island paradise somewhere in the Caribbean, troubled only by turbulent local politics and by the recent violent demise of the Marxist leader Maurice Bishop. However, by the evening of 25th October 1983, Grenada was firmly and loudly on the map.
Early this morning, forces from 6 Caribbean democracies and the United States began a landing or landings on the island of Grenada in the Eastern Caribbean.
At the apparent request of the Dominica leader, Mrs. Eugenia Charles, and other Caribbean leaders, President Ronald Reagan had authorized an attack on the island by 1,000 Marines and paratroopers. Their intervention followed the Bishop government's overthrow and his execution, along with several cabinet colleagues, in a military coup led by hard-line communist officers. The Reagan administration shed few tears for Bishop, but they liked the new regime even less, and they judged, rightly as it turned out, that Grenada's people would welcome the landing of American troops. But 1 year on, and with the island in the midst of its first election campaign since 1976, there are now signs of increasing resentment at the continued US presence. Today in Washington, 21 demonstrators were arrested in an anniversary protest outside the White House. And in Cuba and most of the Eastern Bloc, government statements were issued condemning the invasion and blaming the United States for ruining Grenada's economy. Ed Bradley of CBS television went back to the island to find out what the people who once welcomed the Marines now think of them.
You don't find